So, guys, I do want to talk about TNA Wrestling Slammiversary. So, I've been very supportive of AEW and I'll continue to support them. And just like with every professional wrestling company, like there's ups and downs. So, obviously, TNA Wrestling has its ups and downs, AEW has its ups and its downs, and so does like WWE and other companies as well, really. So, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about, how AEW can improve or what they're doing better than TNA Wrestling, like compare and contrast video. And then the other thing I want to talk about is that, I don't work this weekend. Every other weekend I work at the hospital. So I live in New Haven, Connecticut. So I was kind of like, like what the fuck, really? I was at Slam. No, I was at I was at the Texas Ranger Stadium last week. Why not go to this show, really? Would I want to be working in a dirty, smelly hospital, or would I want to actually, be going to Long Island, where it's like 2 hours away, really, and I don't even have to pay for a hotel room? And then also, they're in Lowell, Massachusetts. We're bound for glory, and, I love Boston, go to Mr. Bartley's and some other great places. So why the hell not, just support another company? And I also paid around $140 for a ticket, It's roughly the same price you would pay for a Ring of Honor ticket, as well, really. So, I do want to talk about, like the whole show, and what I liked and didn't like. What is AEW doing better? What is AEW needs to work on? So like when I was watching the show, like one thing that I don't like is Carlos, in TNA Wrestling. Like, he's just like there to be there, and it's almost like, who the fuck is this guy? And I don't mean to be an asshole. If you guys know who he is, long term, he's kind of been like a general manager or somebody who actually stands out that's different. But in this show, he really didn't. He's just there to be there. I think a lot of people like Carlos because he's not Dixie Carter, really. So it's almost like, when you look at Carlos and Tony Khan, people know that Tony Khan may come off like he's on the autism spectrum. He's a little eccentric, really. So when you have a president of a company, we learn from Vince McMahon that they have to be a big deal, or they have to like make a big deal of themselves. They have to be a character. He kind of Carlos comes off like Ted Turner. Like, I don't think Ted Turner was ever on WCW, but he was kind of like the financial backer or whatever, really. So when you have a leader of a company, we have a president of a company, they need to be speaking, they need to say congratulations, they need to have a personality, and I didn't really see that. He's just an old guy that's not Dixie Carter. That's what I really feel about that. The next thing that I will say, which they did better with TNA Wrestling, is that they had a shorter show and they had a more effective show. That what a lot of people say about AEW. I'm sorry, guys, I'm getting a little bit older, but what they have to say about like the show that they had last week in All In was that it was an 8-hour show, counting the preliminary. So a lot of the matches don't stand out that much when you make a show that long. I actually remember like having a bit of amnesia because I didn't remember a lot from the show, really, because it was so long. And then the other thing is that when you look at Slammiversary, it ran from 7 to 11:30. So that's digestible. That's 4.5 hours for your biggest show in the year, versus if this was AEW, where it's almost twice that length. And then also, with that said, you remember more of the matches, really, because they had, I believe it was like 9 matches in a period of 4.5 hours, instead of doing something like, okay, we're going to have 11, 12 matches, we're going to imitate TNA All In, and we're going to hold people until 3 a.m. or something like that. So I appreciate them having, like a shorter show. I also appreciate them not drawing everything out, because that's one issue with AEW, that longer and more epic does not mean better. It means more drawn out. And I also will say that another big thing that they do better in TNA is that their matches are better, because the problem, because like Moose and the guy that he was facing, Kevin Slater, whatever his name was, like the new X Division champion, that was a really excellent match. That was like the best match of the night, in my opinion. But they did a great like David and Goliath psychology. They did things where this guy would just be hitting Moose and knocking Moose down, or he'd be hitting Moose when Moose is trying to get back up, really. So it's almost like, he knew how to kind of create an advantage, really, this X Division champion. But you've seen matches in AEW, like Will Ospreay matches, where people have talked about like how he did the Spanish Fly off the cage in Los Angeles. The match goes on for another like 20 minutes. Or you have something like, or you have something like, you know what, or like, you know, some of the matches you see in All In where they go like 30, 40 minutes really repeatedly, you know. So sometimes, you know, when you have that, that doesn't look realistic. Or it's almost like, you know, you have like people get hit by pile drivers and then they continue a little bit longer in AEW, really. So I really appreciate the match psychology, really. And then I think, as I said, you know, if you shorten many of the AEW matches at All In by saying, hey, let's be more realistic, let's have some squash matches, let's have Bobby Lashley dominate people instead of like doing something where he's going a little bit longer. So there's a lot more realism in the matches, and I do appreciate that. The next thing that I appreciate about TNA wrestling is pushing big men better, because like I've said, that, you know, Bobby Lashley, they nerfed Bobby Lashley and Shelton. Like, they were getting whacked by a chair many times by Speedball Mike Bailey and Kevin Knight, really. But here you had like that. I think his name was like AJ, like that football player guy. He did like a moonsault. They had a good spot for him. He did a lot of spots with Moose, really. He was kind of like that Goliath, really. It took a lot to take down Moose, really. So, you know, you don't see a 50-50 match between Brody Lee and Marco Stunt. You don't see somebody like Shane Taylor always losing to everybody when he's a big man and a former boxer. You don't see situations like Brian Cage. Like if Brian Cage was in TNA wrestling, he would not be losing as much as he does in AEW. Like, they even had Ricky Starks beat Brian Cage. They've had everybody beat Brian Cage. You won't have Powerhouse Hobbs being lost on the roster, really. Like, I think like a good story that you would do with Powerhouse Hobbs is that since Samoa Joe's out, he becomes the leader of the Ops, and he and Shibata fight out for leadership. And then Joe comes back and he's like, hey, at Forbidden Door, we're going to have a match of who's going to lead the Ops, really. Just to kind of give Hobbs a bit of a storyline, give him a direction, really. You won't have a person like Hobbs, like on the TNA. If he was in TNA, he would not be on that roster all over the place and a little bit lost, really. So they pushed their big men a lot better. The next thing that I will say about TNA wrestling as a criticism, first thing is that they're bad with their championships. And what I mean by that is that obviously the Hardys won the tag team match. You give everything to man Jeff Hardy. They're like the Ric Flairs, or they're like the Triple H of tag team wrestling in TNA. They always win. Whatever is the big show, the Hardys get the title, really. So you always like overdo it with the Hardys. You have to sometimes subvert expectations. They can't always win on big shows and everything like that, really. But I feel like they do that a little too much. Like they really suck their dicks in TNA wrestling. But the two big matches, like the women's knockouts championship match, you gave the titles to JC Jane. If I'm saying her name right. And then you also gave the men's title to Trick Williams. So they do that a lot in TNA wrestling, and that was one of the issues when I used to watch in the Dixie Carter days, which was you give it to other companies, you give wins to other companies. I understand sometimes you have to do that to establish realism, but I remember like they had like Kazarian lose a couple of matches, and then I remember like, you know, how I think they had Kushida, if I remember that was correctly, for a couple of months. He was the X Division champion, and he was the New Japan Pro Wrestling champion. So you have to kind of like be a little bit smarter about, okay, you know, who should be holding championships. Are we going to give it to other people, or like at Forbidden Door in London? Are you going to give it? Are you going to do a match like maybe like Dustin versus Hiroshi Tanahashi? Hiroshi Tanahashi is retiring. His last match is in Japan. So do you want to do something like give the TNT title to Hiroshi Tanahashi? Do you want to do something where Tetsuya Naito and Jon Moxley had a match for the NJPW championship last year? Do you want to do something where it's Tetsuya Naito taking the title from Hangman Adam Page, really? Do you want to do something where you have Bandito and you're having like Roppongi 3K, take his ROH championship, or do you want to do something where Mystico takes the ROH championship or anything like that? Like one thing that I'll give AEW credit for is that they don't do that a lot in AEW. I think they've done that before, but they do that very rarely, where they give titles or they have the biggest show of the year and they give moments to other companies' wrestlers. And that's another thing that'll tie in. Like at Hangman Adam Page winning at All In was the best choice. They gave it to Moxley, or they did something like say, hey, you know what, we're going to have MJF cash in and take away the moment, or hey, we're going to do something like we're going to give it to Brian. We're going to have Bryan Danielson win the Casino Gauntlet and take it from Hangman Adam Page, really, because former WWE people are marketable. They didn't do that, so they also know when to use the right moments. Like this was Santana's moment. He's over in the Bronx. You saw a lot of people with the Puerto Rican flag, and other things like that. You had like your largest attendance. You could have made him a new star, really, like the X Division champion. That guy was like the biggest star of the night, really, because he got endorsed by AJ Styles, really. But they could have used this moment to make a big star. And I also think that this is kind of another issue with TNA, with both companies. And this is one of the big problem is that they're not good with building new stars, really. Because again, you did a lot for the X Division guy, but now Santana got over really big. This is his city. Why couldn't you say, hey, our largest attendance, we have AJ Styles, we have Bully Ray. People are talking about this guy Carlos, who is doing a lot of goodwill for TNA. Why can't you do something where you have Santana win tonight, really, and get over really, really large? You make Trick Williams, you give back Trick Williams in a couple of weeks, or you do a triple threat between Trick Williams, Santana, and AJ Styles, or you do Santana versus AJ Styles at Bound for Glory. Like, you do something like that. That would make a lot of sense, really. Like old generation versus new generation. CM Punk versus MJF or something like that. But the point of it is that they struggle with building new stars because they really didn't have an opportunity for Santana. But with AEW, they do that a lot, really. You have Anthony Bowens, who could be a megastar. You have Mark Briscoe, who could have been a megastar. You had Ricky Starks in that group as well. And a couple other people who could have been like really, really big deals. The other issue, and I think that you can kind of is questionable for both companies, is that sometimes they do a good job pushing their veterans. Like when Matt and Jeff Hardy were in AEW, that was horrible with how they treated them. But you also treated Sting very well, really. So sometimes in both companies, in my opinion, they do right by veterans. They do right by wrestlers that they sign that can be marketable. Like there's a reason why Bryan Danielson can still go and he's had matches with Will Ospreay. That's good usage. But it's also bad that when you had Jeff and Matt Hardy in AEW, they didn't go after the ROH titles or the TNA titles. Well, you could have done Swerve and Keith Lee or the Acclaimed versus Matt and Jeff Hardy, but they didn't do that, really. So there has to be something said about questionably booking veterans. One other big thing that I'll say, and I think one glaring thing, is that the women's division is booked better in TNA wrestling. Like, first of all, when you look at AEW, really, there are only 3 people right now who are big deals in AEW, and that's Athena being the ROH champion. I've also said the sad thing about Athena, which is she's been champion for over 1,000 days. She's the longest reigning champion of the 21st century. That's with a women's championship. But if you look online, it's like Tori Wilson or somebody else who held in WWE who's credited for that. So it's Athena, and then the next person is Toni Storm, and then Mercedes Moné. And Tony and Mercedes have been feuding with each other a lot, really. But you don't really see a lot of other women stand out in AEW recently. They don't have that good of a women's division. They don't have a lot of women that stand out that much. They're even when you looked at the Casino Gauntlet match, yes, some people were happy to see certain people, but they could have done something where they could have had Willow face Marina in the main event of the Texas Death Match. That should have happened. If you're seeing Aminata and Tekla fight each other, why can't you just do something where you lead to something else, really? Why can't you do something where, um, you know what, you have like Billy Starks beat Luther with a chair or whatever. Really, why can't you kind of create moments and instigation with your women's wrestlers? Why can't AEW do more of that? They used to, like when they had Nyla Rose attack Rio, but they kind of have really dropped the ball. Really, there's no like big moments. There's no experimenting with a lot of female wrestlers. Like with Tessa Blanchard, she did an excellent job. She knew that she was a heel. She knew that she was controversial, but she attacked one of the ring announcers, and that is what AEW is lacking. Really, you don't do something like you have a roster of women, and it's almost like it's really just Mercedes and Toni Storm. Um, what about somebody like, as I said, if Tekla is known for getting fired from a company, known for being on probation, why don't you have her as the bad girl that's kind of creating a lot of fights? Why don't you do something where she takes something far? Maybe she does a CM Punk thing where she has a fight backstage in front of Tony Khan and she wrestles and she throws something to Tony Khan and Tony gets mad saying like, hey, you know what? You're on extended probation, or hey, you know what? I'm going to book you against, somebody on the roster to teach you a lesson, like Chris Statlander or Willow, to teach you to stop, fucking around. Really, why can't you do a street fight between Marina Shafir and Willow, which should have happened at All In? That would have been a great match. Why aren't you? It looks like they're setting up Blood and Guts, but I don't see. I see Colt Cabana getting attacked. I see Darby being pissed off with the Death Riders, but I don't see Chris Statlander, and I see Chris Statlander getting involved really. But you're not doing something like maybe Chris Statlander and Marina are giving eyes to Willow Nightingale. Willow Nightingale's like, okay, I can fight both of you, or I'm going to bring somebody in who wants to actually, kind of help out with the business. Like, what about Thunder Rosa, who's been very passionate? What about maybe Layla Hirsch, who has been, who had a feud with Marina Shafir in Ring of Honor? Like, why aren't you, like, creating a lot of emotions on the women? And then the other thing too is that Marina Shafir has not done a good job with the Death Riders. She's kind of like a quiet ass version of China. Really, she's not had matches. She's not going after the women's championships, and Moxley's not endorsed her to go after any women's championships. So there is a lot of missed opportunities with how women are pushed in AEW. They could do a lot more for their women. They may have better matches, but as a collective, their women just feel like an afterthought. Their women don't have like these really big instigation moments and other things like that. Like, as I said, hiring Tessa, keeping Tessa on the TNA roster, it was controversial, but the good thing is that Tessa knows how to be, the cunt of the cunts, really, and get a reaction. So that's why she's there. When you look at somebody like Athena, who's been poorly utilized, she's a very bossy, bitchy girl, really. But it's almost like, why can't you do more with her? Why can't you have her attack Luther? Why can't you have her, like when Billy Starks gets beaten by Toni Storm? Why can't you have like Athena punish her by beating her with a chair until Toni Storm saves Billy Starks and being like, hey, you know what? You're not hurting this little girl, really, because you know what? She's defenseless, or something like that. Why can't you kind of like have emotionally triggering moments, like, especially the majority of women? Why can't you do something like Thunder Rosa saying, hey, you know what, the Casino Gauntlet match means a lot to me because I've been losing recently. I want to bring it home to Mexico. I've been talking to Tony Khan about doing Wrestle Dream in Mexico City because I want to celebrate diversity. Like, there's really no motivations for a lot of these women wrestlers. You just had I think, $100,000 match. So it's just showing that Julia Hart and Tekla and Sky Blue, the goth girls, are all together, really. But you're not going to do a trios or tag team tournament with the women when that can kind of be a good incorporation, really. So with TNA Wrestling, in my opinion, they do book their women's wrestlers a lot better. And that's something Tony Khan has lost track of. And I also think that another thing that what I see with TNA Wrestling is that I think there's a lot more passion by the president. I think with Tony Khan, he had a very bad week, really. He went from 27,000 or 28,000 people in Texas, and now his show in Chicago is 1,100 people. And if you want to do some Scott Steiner math, that on Slammiversary drew roughly 7 times more people. Like, honestly, I would be very, very, like, mad if I was Tony. And your next week match is Hangman Adam Page versus Wheeler Yuta, a person that's been criticized. And a lot of people are calling that a stupid match. A lot of people are saying, why is the Death Rider still continuing? Why are we doing a part 2? Wasn't the final thing Hangman taking the title from Moxley? Because, like I said, more than likely what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the blood and guts in a couple weeks in Chicago to boost a rating, when it's like you just have the Texas Death Match. Isn't it a little repetitive? Or why are we having blood and guts in Chicago? Or why we're going to save it for Philadelphia? Can we do that at Forbidden Door? Because wouldn't that draw a lot more money to have a match like that? Wouldn't the match mean a lot more if you had it at a Forbidden Door where you'd be more violent and you can show like the Wembley, like the England crowd, a diversity of matches, really, because really their goal has to be getting to Wembley Stadium and making that a sellout, really. So I really think that when I see Carlos, and what a lot of people say about him is that he is a man that gives a fuck, really. He understands that if TNA doesn't succeed, it's a financial investment, really. He also learned from Dixie Carter, which is don't be a complacent bitch, really. Like when I see Carlos and how people talk about it, when I even look at his face, really, he looks like somebody that's like, you know what, I give a fuck about the company. If people like me a lot, I'll be handing out concessions. Give me a broom, I'll be sweeping whatever. With Tony Khan, I feel like he's complacent. Like I said, with Tony Khan's psychology, Tony Khan's a little bit afraid to trust other people, and I understand that, because some people are afraid to give up power because of ego issues. Some people may be bullied their entire life, and they don't want to be in the role of have everybody take over what you want to take over. And then there's also the bar rescue philosophy, like in bar rescue, where people don't want to have that John Taffer type of person that's like, hey, you're doing it wrong, really, so you need to have somebody come in with more experience and do it right. And then when you can do it right, when you are mentored by this person, you get the ball back, really. Well, and I don't feel Tony does that. I don't think he has the humility to say, hey, that's egregious. You don't go from 28,000 people. Let's call it 28,000 or 29. Let's call it 29,000. You don't go from 29,000 to having to having like less than 5% of that at your follow-up show, and then you have like fuckheads like Simon Miller saying shit like, oh well, I don't care about how many people that have the draw. I just watch to watch, really. When ultimately, as somebody who reviews professional wrestling, when I see AEW do a small attendance, I would never say that. I would be like, hey, that's embarrassing. The fact that Slammiversary drew 7 times more than your follow-up show is fucking embarrassing, really. And that should motivate AEW to be like, hey, you know what, people are talking about it becoming better than AEW. That should be a motivation for AEW to be like, okay, that's an embarrassment. We need to do better. So when I look at Tony Khan and I look at Carlos, I think that I see Carlos more as a person that's like, this thing has to work or everybody is fucked, really. And I don't see that Tony Khan. I see him as someone throwing money at a problem and not really just like looking at a match card being like, hey, you know what, we do better than Wheeler Yuta, who's been universally criticized, facing our new champion. And people are saying Death Riders is over. Why is the world going back to Death Riders? So I see complacency in Tony Khan. I see more passion with Carlos. And I also think the last thing that I would say is long-term vision. That really the biggest thing that AEW has to do, and I need to do a video about this, is that their goal for the next year is to sell out Wembley Stadium. Their goal is to get 80,000 people. They need to talk about that. They need to market that. They need to improve their television. They need to listen to the fans. That is their goal. But I really think that when I look at AEW, they just kind of coast along, really. They coast along, and that's that. And I think with Carlos, his long-term vision, I don't know what it is, really, but I don't know what it is, but it really hints to me that he wants to make sure TNA Wrestling continues to do great attendance. Like, as I said, UBS Arena, they got like 50% capacity from a show that's consistently drew 3,000, 2,000 or 3,000 people, and now you're drawing like over 8,000. That is an accomplishment. That is highly, highly commendable, and I respect that. And if if you have WWE people and it draws more people, so be it. He understands his vision is to make sure people like Jeff and Matt Hardy, Santana, other people have food on their plates. But when I look at people like Tony Khan, I really, really just don't see that. I just see him throwing money at a problem, really, and that's that, really. I don't see him saying, hey, you know what, I'm embarrassed. I'm fucking embarrassed that our follow up show to All In has less than 1,100 people. Oh, we're going to the ECW arena in fucking Philadelphia. I want those bitches. I want that bitchin' arena of an arena to be sold out every single day. I want to make sure when we do residencies in Chicago when it's 5,000 people that we get like at least 5,000 people. But if we do like 4,500, no problem really. Like I really think with AEW, they have a lot more complacency. They don't have a long-term vision. They need to say, okay, we need to improve our attendance. We need to listen to the crowd. We need to revamp ROH and make that a developmental show. We need to revamp Collision to make it like Dynamite Part 2 or make it like a SmackDown where you have different people, you have different championships. You also treat it like a show where, you have Kyle Fletcher and Dustin Rhodes and other people who will be stars to kind of, prepare them for the Dynamite show, But I think that, AEW is a mess of a company, really. And I think with TNA Wrestling, they ultimately want a television deal. They want to have big pay-per-views. They want to draw money. They want to survive, really. And that's how I feel about it. I just don't get that from AEW. I think that, like I said, they just have an issue with complacency. So, and that's where I'm going to leave it at. I just think that there's ups and downs with both companies. There are a lot of ups and downs with every single company. There's things that WWE is not doing right. Both these shows are affordable. All in. I was near the ringside area. I was in the ringside area for Slammiversary. If I was in WWE, I would be paying $500 to be like maybe so far away, really. So I want to say this that there are a lot of things that Tony Khan can do better by watching the show. There's a lot of things that TNA can do better by watching Tony Khan, really. So this is a good kind of comparison to see what you guys think about it. And ultimately, we should expect better from every company because ultimately, we don't want a cycle of three-way complacency with TNA, AEW, and WWE.